Good evening, everyone. Hopefully I'm coming through loud and clear. If panel members could give me a wee, yeah, there's a wee nod. First of all, can I thank you all so much for waiting and for being here tonight. It's this wonderful new world we live in that you can be late for one meeting when all you have to do is still stay in the same place looking at the same screen. Parliamentary business overran there a little, so hence why I'm a little bit late. My name is Ruth Maguire. I'm the member of the Scottish Parliament for Cunningham South in Ayrshire. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for the cross-party group on Commercial Sexual Exploitation's event tonight, which is on how to challenge men's demand for prostitution and sex trafficking in Scotland. The cross-party group, which I co-convene with Labour MSP Rhoda Grant, understands all commercial sexual exploitation to be a function of inequality and a form of violence against women. Our Scottish Government understands that too. Equally safe is the Scottish Government's national violence against women and girls approach, and their definition of violence against women includes all commercial sexual exploitation, including prostitution. It has done for years. We're very clear in our belief that commercial sexual exploitation has been shown to be harmful for individuals involved, and more than that, has a negative impact on the position of all women and girls through the objectification of women's bodies. Our cross-party group promote the pursuit of legislation which prevents and challenges male demand as a route to stopping this violence. It is a minority of men who purchase sexual access to women and girls in Scotland, but the damage that minority do is pervasive. It impacts our whole society and puts women and girls in harm's way. It has been a source of frustration that legislation in our country has not matched policy so far. So I want to warmly welcome that Minister for Community Safety, Ash Denham, is currently taking action on that front on behalf of the Scottish Government and consulting on the matter with a view to remedying that anomaly. Many of you will have seen recent reports in the press around women trafficked here in Scotland and exploited. Now, Scotland is not unique in that regard, but it should be to our collective shame that at the moment our country is a place where our legislative framework means that criminal gangs profiting from sexual exploitation of women trafficked to meet male demand can hide in plain sight using so-called adult services websites. Even a cursory glance at one of these sites today would show you in towns and cities across Scotland tonight there are women who've been trafficked here from both from other countries and across our own, who are being subjected to abuse, violence and humiliation to satisfy the demand of a minority of men who wish to purchase sexual access to women and girls. The good news is that our Scottish Parliament has all the powers it needs to take legislative action and end, not mitigate, the serious harms and abhorrent abuses of human rights, commercial sexual exploitation visits on women and girls. And I'm very hopeful we're on our way to doing that, but there is still a lot of work to be done. We have work to do in building public and parliamentary understanding of the need to criminalise paying for sex, decriminalise selling sex, and provide exit services for victims of sexual exploitation in Scotland. And we need to learn from countries that have adopted a sex buyer law about why they adopted this legislation and what impact it's had on demand for prostitution and sex trafficking. So I'm delighted to say that we're joined this evening by wonderful expert speakers who will help us do just that. And I'm very grateful for them all being here with us. Can I warmly welcome Najat Vallaud-Belkacem, former Minister for Women's Rights from France; Diane Martin CBE, survivor and exiting practitioner from here in Scotland; Tsitsi Matekaire, global lead, End Sex Trafficking, Equality Now; Mia de Faoite, survivor and policy advisor from Ireland; Sigríður Björk Guðjónsdóttir, National Commissioner of Police, Iceland; and Piers Anders Sunesson, Ambassador at Large for Combating Trafficking in Persons from Sweden. Now, our first speaker tonight is Najat. She is currently one of One's France director, an NGO who fight against extreme poverty and preventable diseases. And between 2012 and 2017, under President Francois Hollande's mandate, she became Minister in charge of women's rights and was the spokesperson of the government. Then the Minister of National Education, Higher Education and Research, and she was the first woman to ever hold this position in France. Najat, over to you. We're delighted you're here.
Sorry, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Okay. Well, I'm very happy to be with you. Thank you very much for your invitation. First, maybe why has France adopted abolitionist legislation on prostitution? The law penalizing the client of prostitution, or sex buyer law, was my most difficult and at the same time most exciting battle as Minister for Women's Rights in France. Prostitution is a topic that immediately provokes epidermal reactions, hours and hours of debate on TV or at family dinners, because it appears to be like a question of morals, of sexuality, of fear that the law could interfere under your roof, in your bedroom, in your intimacy. 65 years ago, however, the world recognized prostitution as a problem that feeds on human trafficking. The New York Convention, with an abolitionist aim and signed on 1947, is a universal tool that commits the signatory states to repress this violence. However, European countries diverge on this matter. It's well known that Greece or Germany authorize brothels and therefore do not penalize pimps, clients, or prostitutes. In Germany, the turnover of this business is huge in the country. Prostitution will generate like 50 million euros per day. These amounts are of little benefit to the 400,000 active prostitutes, obviously. In the Netherlands, prostitution has been totally decriminalized, even if there is a desire to curb it, particularly in Amsterdam. Elsewhere, it is regulated and pimping is often condemned. Although it was adopted in 2009 in Norway and Iceland, the penalization of the client has not yet become generalized, despite the great success of Sweden. This disparity of regulation on prostitution in Europe is a subject that must be put on the table, and especially at the time of European elections. So to come back to my experience in France, I was really looking up to Sweden since many years, and I considered that France was late, and to put it bluntly, completely missing the point. My conviction was that it was up to the politicians to take the initiative. It was up to politicians in particular to show how the current system was feeding into the globalized crime industry. Indeed, at the time, 90% of the prostitutes who worked in the national territory were of foreign origin. The vast majority of them were brought there by others to carry out these activities, which considerably reduces the thesis of consent advocated by all the anti-abolitionists. No, prostitution is not an ordinary activity like any other. No one can believe that migrant women decide one by one to come and prostitute themselves on the Parisian sidewalks. Prostitutes in France were imported in Western Europe from Africa, Eastern Europe, or Asia by extremely violent networks. So this French sex buyer law, well, my aim was to help France progress with this law. To do that, my goal was for prostitutes to be recognized as victims, to offer them exit services which could help them escape prostitution networks and give them an opportunity to reintegrate the labor market through social medical support, job training, provision of a substitute income. This is why a fund of 20 million euro was included in our law. The goal was also for prostitutes to no longer be forced, but instead encouraged to testify with protective measures, anonymity, borrowed identity, borrowed address, and so on. It is essential that their safety is guaranteed, and it would help fight against human trafficking. And the law was also designed to limit as much as possible the entry of women into prostitution networks and support them to leave these networks. What my experience of adopting this legislation was like? Well, my personal convictions on the matter have always been very strong, but unfortunately, they were not shared by many people. I was accused of all wrongs, at best a censor, a naive person who understood nothing at all, at worst a prostitute phobic who was trying to eradicate them. Press coverage followed one after the other against my position. I was mocked. The polls said the French disagreed with my reform. The political leaders of my own political family, afraid of looking bad, chose to remain silent. I also had to face a strong public opposition. Some artists signed tribunes like the one of the 343 bastards entitled "Don't Touch My War." They were provocatively exploiting an analogy with women, the 343 sluts, who had the courage in 1971 to say that they had had an abortion. And I remember answering them in a press briefing that the 343 sluts demanded in their time to be able to freely dispose of their bodies, but the 343 bastards demanded the right to dispose of the bodies of others. And I think that calls for no further comment. Finally, the subject of criminalizing prostitution clients was widely misunderstood in France. Too often, the debate has focused on the freedom of the client rather than the need to protect those women. Fighting for this sex buyer law means that we have to debunk myths. First, one of the two main arguments presented is carried by some prostitutes themselves who defend their right to sell their bodies because it belongs to them based on free choice. I concede that the changes implied by the law require courage, but I reject the idea that prostitution would be an enviable job, especially since it is generally not practiced for long, but a shorter life expectancy, violence, risks, and serious health problems. There are many documents that underline the horror of prostitution and the impossible path one must follow to get out of it. The most convincing one is the testimony of survivors of prostitution that I received at the ministry and who told me how broken they were. And I think Diane and Mia are the best placed to tell us more about it. The second argument I heard the most was the endangering of prostitutes by pulling them away from health structures. This argument didn't make any sense since in France, prostitutes were the ones penalized until then. I believe it is also the case in Scotland, with the soliciting in public places. The sex buyer law doesn't endanger prostitutes more than penalizing them, and is of course designed to implement exit services and health support which were missing until then. Finally, what is the impact of this legislation? It took very, very, very long discussions, all possible contortions, surprising political alliances to have the law finally adopted. The law was eventually voted in April 2016, 4 years after its announcement and 2.5 years after its introduction. Until the last minute, I didn't give up. I didn't want to miss any chance, any vote. The Sunday preceding the day of the vote, we called almost one by one the members of parliament to convince them. The law was finally adopted with 130 votes of difference. Our relentless effort had paid off, and above all, I was deeply convinced that we had taken an essential step and reached a point of no return. And that is what I can conclude now. 5 years later, when the French are questioned about this law, 75% of them consider it is a good thing. A recent evaluation report shows that this law was really an abolitionist turning point in our country. Indeed, thanks to the reversal of the criminal charge to clients, there has been a 54% increase in the number of proceedings for pimping and the fight against human trafficking. The compensation for victims of pimping and human trafficking was multiplied by 7. 395 people have benefited from a path out of prostitution, entitling them to a residence permit, priority access to housing and financial aid. Nearly 5,000 clients of prostitution have been arrested since the law was passed. And the law has also made it possible to reallocate more than 2 million euros of seized pimp funds to support prostitutes. We have to keep in mind that a law alone is not enough. We also have a duty to educate younger generations about gender equality. It is not only a question of fighting against violence, the specific oppression represented by prostitution, but it's also about teaching the principle that a woman's body is not for sale, that is not an object, that a woman is not a commodity. My only regret now is that, as you know, the government has changed since then, and now this law seems to me insufficiently enforced, particularly because the public authorities have not invested the resources to do so since 2017. Neither the financial resources nor the serious adaptation to the new dimension of prostitutions. Only 10% of convictions for aggravating pimping are related prostitution on the internet. And not even political leadership. The Interministerial Monitoring Committee has not met since June 2017. Sorry. For instance, exit services aimed at helping people leave prostitution networks have been very slowly implemented. In 2019, only 300 people benefited from it. So as you can see, it is very important to adopt a law, but what is also very important is to be consistent and to stay, you know, with the same objective and the same aim and the same motivation in a longer time if you want to have some results. That's all about my experience. I hope it can be useful for you.
Thank you, Najat. That's very, very helpful. And apologies for coming to you first. I'd muddled up the order, but I'll come to speakers in the order they were expecting as we move forward. Najat spoke there about the importance of listening to survivors. So I would acknowledge that and recognise that. And I am delighted to be introducing Diane Martin CBE next. Having survived prostitution in her late teens, Diane spent nearly 2 decades supporting women to exit prostitution, with 15 years as the founder and director of a specialist service for women involved in or exiting from street prostitution, developing a range of services from street outreach, drop-in and court diversion through to aftercare, counselling and life skill groups. In 2013, Diane was awarded a CBE for services to vulnerable women in prostitution. Diane, you're very welcome. Over to you now, please.
Just getting a message to unmute.
Sorry, Diane, you may have...
I'm clicking on...
That's you now, we can hear you now.
Okay. I've clicked on mute, but I need to kind of go invisible. I'm sorry, I've just got my phone and it helps me a lot to be able to refer to my notes to stay on track. So you won't be able to see me while I speak, but then I will be delighted to come back. It's great to be in such good company tonight. With the other speakers and also everyone joining us across the UK, and I know that there are people in other countries that are also joining us. So welcome, it's great to be with you, and I'm just going to be invisible for a short period. Right. As Ruth said, I'm a Scottish survivor of commercial sexual exploitation. In my late teens, I was exploited through prostitution in London and then trafficked to a prostitution ring in the Middle East. Over the past 25 years, I've had the absolute privilege of helping hundreds of women exit prostitution and rebuild their lives. My own experience was in what was ridiculously termed high-class prostitution, run by an agency that was referred to as the safest in London. And I can tell you that there was nothing high class about getting raped or having bite marks on my face or being asked at gunpoint if my mum knew where I was and if I would like to see her again. The location or the surroundings do not reduce the impact of what is experienced, and we must dismiss the false narrative around women and girls choosing prostitution. Prostitution chooses women and girls, and demand creates prostitution and trafficking. Everyone involved in prostitution must be entitled to the support they need. However, tonight I will be centering women and girls in order to reflect the reality of those most affected by commercial sexual exploitation. As many of you will be aware, experts in this field state that sexual exploitation and sex trafficking in Scotland is at epidemic proportions. Trafficking and pimping is big business, and adult websites also incentivize that and make it easy. They are effectively encouraging violence against women, and for wider society, they perpetuate harmful stereotypes and gender inequality. As Ruth has said, the Scottish Government rightly states, and has done so for 10 years, that prostitution is violence against women and girls. Therefore, we must seek to actively eradicate commercial sexual exploitation, holding perpetrators to account and providing sustainable exit routes for the women and girls whose vulnerabilities are exploited as they're funneled into the dehumanizing system of prostitution. We also need to cut it off at the root through prevention. Otherwise, we're just picking up the pieces of ruined lives, and that is just not good enough. I want to see our government adopt what is usually referred to as the Nordic model or the sex buyer's law, legislation which completely decriminalizes those selling sex and that also provides specific support for them to exit. We need to see our government's policy transformed into a very real and tangible response, where the sex buyers, pimps, traffickers and third-party facilitators who create the demand are criminalised. Traffickers and pimps are willing to take big risks because of the sizable profits, but they also want to reduce risks where they can so that their crimes can carry on uninterrupted. Evidence shows that they will favour operating in countries where the demand is not tackled by the criminal justice system. So currently, here in the UK and here in Scotland, it's good for organised crime. So we need that policy that we've got to be enacted in very real and tangible ways. We need it backed up with end-demand legislation that redirects the criminal focus onto traffickers, pimps, third-party facilitators, and sex buyers. There's a lot of myths that come about when we're talking about adopting a sex buyer law or talking about the Nordic model. Those that support the sex trade want pimps and sex buyers to be legitimised as managers and clients and to present what is abuse as work, even sometimes framing it around human rights. Those describing themselves as independent, empowered sex workers who have chosen this supposed work constitute a minuscule minority of those in the sex trade. When I was running exiting services, we supported on average of 215 women a year. That was just in one borough in London, and I never met one woman who didn't want to get out. We also heard a few weeks ago at our Romanian summit that 83% of Romanian women want to exit prostitution and that 60% would not describe it as a job or tell someone else to get involved. The reality is that there are nearly always underlying issues that create the conditions of vulnerability. Most women and girls' routes into prostitution have been underlying issues that contribute to a pathway of vulnerability that can include a lack of choice, poverty, childhood sexual abuse, neglect, addiction, or coercive and controlling relationships. This is why we must rid ourselves of the false dichotomy we are continually presented with, that of course sex trafficking is bad, but prostitution is a choice and a job. Both rely on gender inequality and vulnerability. Both are inherently harmful, trapping women and girls in a violent and predatory system. Both are fueled by demand, and often it's the same men paying. And if it is supposedly a job, then it's not one that alleviates poverty, but more often than not, it traps women there, often in debt or under control. So no matter how you got here, no matter what you knew beforehand, whether you were born in Bucharest, Romania, or Dundee, Scotland, the exploitation feels exactly the same, and you should be given all the support you need. We also hear that if we adopt a sex buyers law, that it will be that prostitution will be driven underground. They say it will drive everything underground, but it won't. Prostitution, by its very nature, needs to provide a way to supply the demand to the sex buyer. There's also the myth of making it safer and the myth of the good punter. They say if we adopt this law, it will clear out all the good sex buyers and leave the dangerous ones. It won't. And the myth of the good punter is just that, a myth, often described as irregular. Well, in Ipswich, in England, Steve Wright was a regular, known by many of the women. That didn't stop him murdering 5 of them. They will say they won't be able to vet sex buyers. Well, they can't vet them now. You cannot tell who's going to be violent or kill you. And many women have no say in who the sex buyer is. Once you're in that car or behind that closed door, you're extremely vulnerable to violence and exploitation. Those with a vested interest in the sex industry are organised and loud. But when you look globally and locally at those most affected, they are a minority that should not get to dictate policy. Scottish women and girls have a human right to live a life free from violence and exploitation, and to live in a country where we do not have to resort to survival prostitution, or where we're forced through coercive relationships into the harms of the sex trade. I want Scotland to be a progressive country. I want our girls and boys to grow up in a society where we have genuine equality. It's gender inequality that make women and girls vulnerable to sexual exploitation in the first place. And we will never have gender equality while men are able to pay for the use of women's bodies delivered behind the closed door. Pimps, traffickers, third-party website facilitators, and sex buyers are encouraging and enabling what happens behind that closed door. I have listened for over 25 years to women who have experienced being behind that closed door. I was behind that closed door, the door of 5-star hotels, the door of palaces, and the door of diplomat embassies. What's behind that door is entitled men who believe that paying affords them permission to do anything, to rape, to threaten, to instill fear. On many occasions, I wondered if I would even get out from behind that same door. Something must be done, and something can be done. What's fantastic, as we've heard tonight, and as we'll also hear later in the evening, is there are countries where they've implemented this, and we've got a good evidence base that it works and that it also changes mindsets. In conclusion, we need a vision for Scotland, a long-term vision, and a vision that becomes a reality we can be proud of. A reality here in Scotland that rejects women being for sale with the inherent harm that results. A reality that robustly addresses the demand by criminalising pimps, traffickers, website facilitators, and sex buyers. A reality where these websites, who by providing advertising facilitate what in most cases is paid rape, are no longer permitted to operate. This is far from a cost-free business, and that cost is being paid for by the women and exploitation of women and girls. The Scottish Government needs to draw a firm line and robustly act on these realities. I'm so grateful for Ruth and for Rhoda and for Ash and for many others who are taking these issues so seriously. Our government's policy cannot be in word only, however good those words, they need to mean something tangible for those exploited through prostitution and trafficking, where women and girls are provided with resourced and realistic options in order to get out of the sex trade and truly build the lives they would choose for themselves. You can make a difference and have your voice heard by submitting a response to the Scottish Government's current consultation on how to challenge men's demand for prostitution. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll come back now and look forward to hearing from everyone else.
There you are. Nice to see you again. Diane, thank you so much for sharing your personal and professional experience with us. We're going to move on to our next speaker now, Per Anders Sunesson. The Swedish government appointed Mr. Sunesson Ambassador at Large for combating trafficking in persons in May 2016. Prior to this assignment, he upheld a position as Director General at the Ministry of Health and Social Affairs, where he was in charge of the Division for Family and Social Services. Ambassador Sunesson has since his appointment visited and conducted bilateral discussions regarding human trafficking for sexual exploitation with more than 30 countries. You're very welcome this evening, Per Anders. We'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. I hope you all can hear me. Good afternoon, good evening from Stockholm and my kitchen. It's great to be with you all tonight. I'm very happy to participate in this seminar, and I really want to thank Scottish Parliament's cross-party group on commercial sexual exploitation and the UK Feminista for inviting me. I also want to say to my co-panelists that it's truly an honor to be speaking alongside with you on this event, and a special thanks to you survivors for your testimonies. So important. I also really need to take this opportunity to say thank you to Najat, and I'm sorry for using your first name only. Najat is one of the bravest politicians I know of, and I'm a friend of Grégoire Thierry of CAP International, and he has told me all about your leadership and all the efforts you took to get this law in place in France. And the French law is really the Swedish law 2.0, and I cannot enough underline how important it was to have France take this decision. So thank you so much. So I've been asked to talk about the reasons behind the Swedish law and the reasons why Sweden, as the first country in the world, 1999, adopted a law that criminalizes buying sex, but not the person who is selling his or her body. And it was just like in France. It was thanks to strong women that this happened in Sweden. Before 1999, there was no legislation on prostitution, and it was really earlier not a big issue. But there was a big discussion about men's violence against women and gender inequality in the Swedish society. And Swedish women's lobby, Swedish women's organizations, they were really pushing the Swedish government in front of them, saying, you need to look into the structures behind men's violence against women and the structures behind gender inequality. And finally, the Swedish government what governments do when the heat gets too tough. They put together a governmental inquiry to investigate. And it was during this investigation that the issue of prostitution came up, because the investigators, they could see that there was a lot of violence going on against women in prostitution. And it was obvious that it was to 99.9% men using their financial power to buy access to women's bodies. And that was really not compatible with the ambitions the Swedish government had for gender equality in our society. So to make a long story short, the women's lobby pushed the government once again to put together a governmental inquiry to look into prostitution. And they did. And they did a thorough job. they talked to very many of those women who were in prostitution back then in Sweden, and they talked to the Johns. And guess what? Do you think they met young, strong entrepreneur women saying, you know, this is the profession I choose for myself? They met young girls who almost everyone had a documented history of sexual abuse or drug problems during their upbringing. These were not strong entrepreneur women who made a informed decision to do this. They thought they was no good for anything else, that this was all they were good for, and they, you know, low self-esteem and all that. And then talking to the Johns, you all heard this before. They said things like, well, I'm a man, I have my sexual needs, someone needs to take care of them. I don't have a wife or a girlfriend, so I go to women in prostitution, and I'm nice to them, I pay them, and actually they are just lazy and they like doing this, so I'm doing them a favor, stuff like that. It was a really ugly picture that was painted from these interviews. And when they came public, there was a public outcry in Sweden. People said, this is not the kind of society we want. This is not the kind of society we want our children to grow up in. So after a long discussion, and there were some people saying, you know, no, we should not criminalize selling sex because it's the oldest profession and so on. And it's just going to make it more dangerous for those who are in prostitution. But finally, the Swedish government decided that, no, we don't want prostitution in our society. So then the next discussion was, okay, so should we criminalize both the buyer and the seller? And some people were saying, yes, we should. But other people said, no, remember the results from the inquiry. These are not criminals, these women in prostitution. They should be offered help and support to leave prostitution. And we should put the blame where it belongs, on the person who is using his financial power to use someone else's vulnerability. And that was the decision from the Swedish government. So 1999, we had this law. And I would say that first, it was about 50-50 people pro and against the law. We had to put quite a lot of resources into training judges, police officers, and prosecutors on this topic. But today, I would say that somewhere around 80% is firmly behind the law in Sweden. If you talk to Swedish police, I don't think you will ever find any police officer working on this issue that would say that they think that this law has made it worse in any way. No, on the contrary, they say that this law is perfect. The persons in prostitution are no longer afraid to talk to the police. It shifted the power between the buyer and the seller. Someone who is buying sex in Sweden today, he would be very careful not to get caught, because he would go to jail or at least get heavy fines. He would also lose his face because, like I said, most people don't think this is acceptable. So the buyer knows that if he does something, the woman in prostitution can just pick up the phone and call the police, and they will come and pick up the buyer. So we have actually not had one violent crime against someone in prostitution since the law came into force, and not one single murder of someone in prostitution. And I will do a quick comparison with Germany later, but I can say right now that in Germany, who took the opposite path, 2002, and said we're going to regulate prostitution, make it legal and so on, they had more than 80 murders of women since they put their legislation in place. So that system is not protecting the women they thought. So consequences of the Swedish law. Well, like I said, change of mindset. My son is 29 years old. When I talk to him and his friends, they look at me like I'm crazy when I talk about buying access to someone's body. And this is the view of, I would say, most Swedish people. It is not acceptable in a Swedish society almost everyone recognizes this. This is exploitation of someone's vulnerability. Also, the number of women in prostitution has decreased with 50% right away when the law came into force, and has decreased ever since. Of course, this was a time when internet grew big, but we have done comparison with other countries, and the prevalence in Sweden is much, much lower. And like you said, Diane, prostitution did not go underground. That's just a stupid argument, because if you are in the business of selling your body, your customer needs to find you. And if the customers find you, the police can find you. That's just the way it is. And I already said that less violence, and also, yes, both the Swedish police and Interpol, Europol put in their reports that Sweden is almost a dead market for human trafficking, for sexual exploitation, because the demand is so low. It's just not good business to set up a big network in Sweden. Did we have any negative consequences of this legislation? I'd argue no. No negative consequences whatsoever. This has been really successful in Sweden. Of course, if you ask someone who still is in prostitution, she might say that this is not a good law, but they are very, very few. Did we eradicate prostitution in Sweden? No, we did not. Prostitution still exists, just like theft and murders exist, although they are forbidden also. The important thing is that the government sends the signal, this is not acceptable in our society. That's a very, very important signal. So it's already been said, I visited like 40 countries during my 4.5 years in this office. And I always talk to survivors, and I always try to talk to those who still are in prostitution. And I have still yet not met anyone who left prostitution who say, oh, actually that was a choice that I did for a period of my life. I wanted to do that. No, they will testify that they either were forced into it, lured into it, or they saw no other way of putting bread on their table, but they would never have chosen this if they had an option. Diane, you talked about good evidence base. We have excellent evidence base. Just look at Sweden and compare it to Germany. 3 years between our decisions. Sweden went with prohibiting purchase of sex, providing support to those in prostitution. Germany, legislation saying brothels are okay, pimping is okay, and buying sex is okay. Well, Germany today, they have seen a 38% increase in demand. They have 1.2 billion purchases of sex every 24 hours. Approximately 400,000 women in prostitution. 98% approximately of these women are young women from other countries than Germany. They are the ones who have to attend to the huge demand in Germany. And also, Germany have a big problem with gender equality and with organized crime, trafficking for sexual exploitation. And this is not something that I make up. This you can ask any public officer on. So I would like to end my short intervention with a quote, and it's an unknown author. Sex work is a clever euphemism preferred by the pimp lobby to whitewash and sanitize the brutalities of prostitution. Prostitution, or arguing that prostitution is a job, is not about protecting the rights for persons to sell their bodies. It's all about protecting the financial interests of pimps and other people behind this terrific business, or this awful business. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Per Anders. That was very interesting, and I think particularly the note of the shift in public opinion is something that we would be, we're interested to hear about. Our next speaker is Mia de Faoite. Mia is a survivor and activist who spent 6 years in prostitution. She was a core partner in the successful Turn Off the Red Light campaign, which resulted in the passing of the Criminal Law Sexual Offences Act 2017 in Ireland. Mia has spoken publicly about her experiences in the media, has given written and oral evidence in the Dáil, Stormont, Scottish Parliament and the UK Parliament. And since exiting prostitution, Mia has obtained a BA Honours in Philosophy and Sociology and is an LLM Master of Law at Maynooth University. It's really nice to see you this evening. Over to you.
Hi, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I don't know why I'm more nervous online than in front of a room. Why should Scotland adopt this law? Well, I have to go back to why Ireland adopted the law. In 2010, there was a report done here, a research project into what the sex trade was in Ireland, what was going on, what was happening, and the results of that were astonishing. That most of the women were trafficked, the organised gangs and crimes, and that most of the women were migrant women. At the same time, Sweden's 10-year report was published and showed such positive results. There had been a number of people here campaigning for a change in prostitution law for some time, but it was really those two pieces of work that progressed us to the next stage, and a campaign called Turn Off the Red Light was launched. In 2010 was the year I exited prostitution, and was looking for somewhere to place what I had experienced. Although I had left prostitution, and that was with the support of a social worker. I didn't just have an epiphany. I literally, she took hold of me, and she's the reason I got out. But there was nothing. I was in street prostitution for almost 6 years. And there's a reason why I stayed on the street. One, I felt it was safer in the sense that I could run. And two, staying on the street kept me away from, as much as possible, away from pimps and being under that sort of control, because they have conditions with regards if you sign up on sites and stuff. And I just felt, as bad as my life was, it would be 100 times worse if I was fully under their control. That said, in some way, I had a drug addicted partner, and as did many of my friends on the street, and our pimps often come in the form of drug addicted partners. But in those 6 years, there was nothing I experienced nor witnessed that I could find a justification for. The violence is just horrific. So my time was 6 years, okay? And in those 6 years, I experienced a gang rape with my friend. She didn't survive. She died of an overdose a short time later. I had 3 other rapes, countless humiliations and physical violence, and being spat on, and etc. 6 years. There is no other industry or place of work where we would tolerate that level of violence, and yet it happens. It can never be made safe. And like Diane has previously said, because you'll always be on your own with whoever has bought you, and it is up to them and only them how things are going to play out. So it can never be made safe. But also what happens, it can be quite hard to explain that very often buyers, that when they buy you, they haven't initially thought maybe they would be violent, but what happens is, and this is important, is that when they buy you and they pay you, so they consider that they have paid good money for this service, okay, and maybe it's not going quite as they like, or you're not doing or complying as they like. And you know, it's like when you buy something and you take it home and it doesn't work properly. One of the first things you'll do is bang it or shake it. You know, the same principle applies in prostitution. So very often buyers who didn't intend to initially be violent or aggressive towards you, all too often do, because of that principle. So another point I wanted to address was prostitution and sex trafficking. They are intrinsically linked. You have one because of the other. And I witnessed it firsthand for the last 18 months or so of my time. I stood alongside a trafficked woman, and we were very close, although neither of us would have used the term traffic. I wouldn't. But the conditions of her life were so inhumane. She was totally under his control, 10 years under his control when I met her. So she had this twisted sense of loyalty to him. She'd been trafficked out of Africa, and he couldn't stand me being around her or whatever. And I often thought, well, why does he hate me so much? I'm of no threat to him, as I felt. But and then I realized, like, I was a threat, and the threat I was to him, it was the friendship, was the bond, which is why like the biggest threat to him was my humanity to her, and that friendship and that connection. Because traffickers, and you'll see previous speakers have mentioned, and the pop-up brothels and the constant moving around and the no fixed abode, etc., that these women don't get to build up relationships or get to know their area, or, you know, so they get entrenched and entrapped even further. So but she eventually got out with the help of some very good people in Ireland, and then I was out at the time as well. So then I was able to be a credible witness for her legal team, which is rare. And but I wanted to make this point, is that although we had arrived at that street through different methods, different ways, different means, it wasn't the logistics, you know, that connect us. What connects us is that we were bought and used and exploited and often beaten or raped by the same group of individuals, and they are the buyers. And you know, a buyer could buy me one week and her a couple of weeks later, and on 2 occasions we were bought together. And that connection can't be broken by anyone at any time, nor in any country. You know, when we say, when we think about the demand, we must tackle demand. It seems like just a word that's out there, but the demand is men, and I know Pierce has spoken about what they say, and you know, because we can continue to blame pimps and traffickers, and yes, when they're caught, may the hands of the law, you know, fall heavy on them. But if you do nothing to stop the cause, which is the demand, the sex buyers, then the traffic will continue and it'll grow. But these are men. You know, I was a drug addicted. I had an emaciated body and wasn't physical. You know, they buy us when we're sick. They buy us when we're crying. They continue to sexually molest and to have sex with us if there are tears. You know, often our faces are marked, our bodies are marked. They still buy us. So you're not talking about, I don't fully know how to explain that sometimes, but there are some myths. I think Piers and Diane addressed the underground. They're right, it's a fallacy. And I often think, you know, do they think the police are stupid? Like, if the buyers can find them, so can the police. Let me see. It is a system where it's the most inhumane, unequal system where sexual violence and rape thrive. And there is no state, no government that should ever tolerate that. And that is why Ireland, it took us 7 years to change it, to change the law. And we changed the law in March 2017. And it was part of a larger scale but we also got a legal definition of consent in that bill, in that act. Part 4 is the criminalising the buyers, decriminalising the women, and that's often people hear decriminalising, and but to me, full decriminalising is the same as legalising. It's just maybe a nicer word for people to hear, but it's the same thing. So we decriminalise the women, we criminalise the buyers, and then support women to exit. Our law is still in its infancy, and really it's only the last 18 months that there has been movement on it. But we have just a review or a research project has just been published by SERP over here, which is the Sexual Exploitation Research Project. They've just published findings into our law, even though it's so new, but the results are like with Sweden, positive, especially with regards to the police. There has been a major shift from the police in a cultural shift. They now view the women as the more vulnerable. There's very, you know, and they're totally decriminalized. We did keep the brothel keeping law, which often people say they're still criminalizing, but they're anti-pimping laws and they're necessary for the police to have in order to access apartments or brothels and investigate and have welfare checks on the women. So they will be kept, but it's fully supported by the police because they are seeing the value of it. And they have had quite a few successful operations, and when that's resourced and backed up, they're showing great results. And we have had a number of organized crime gangs linked to prostitution rackets in front of the courts at the end of 2019, and there are more on the way. Our Criminal Assets Bureau are also having good success in the money. Regarding following the money. The police here fully support the law, but there is a recognition that everybody has to be on the same line of thinking. So there is still some awareness and training to happen within the police. And with regards to women, and the reports coming back from them is that intelligence and trust and relationships are greatly improving between the police and the women. In fact, women have now begun to report crimes and have had quick and supportive responses from the police, which was what we had hoped. And if I put myself back, if we'd had the law when I was there, and I often think, and sometimes I get frustrated because I think of all the things that I would have told the police if I wasn't criminalized. But back then, I was a criminal. I was part of the criminal system. And when you're part of a criminal system as such, and you're viewed by the outside world as a criminal, then you tend to keep your mouth shut. And that has broke that sort of gap. We have improvements to be made. We have support systems to be set up for the women. We have immigration things to tackle. It's not, but it's, like I say, it's in its infancy, and it's a great step forward for Ireland, especially in regards to gender equality and society in general, because I always think, like, especially in recent years, there's so much about consent and what consent is. And I know previous speakers, and Ruth, you addressed it, that you can give as many lessons in schools and colleges about consent. But as long as it remains legal to buy a woman or drive down a street and pick one out, then the confusion remains. And that confusion, filters through to our homes and our workplaces and society in general. So that confusion, part 4 ended that confusion here, as I hope Scotland will do. So I don't know how long I was speaking for, but I'll just finish now. But it is it's an industry mostly run by criminals who make millions off the backs of the most vulnerable women and girls. Really, it's trading in trauma, and every penny they make comes from the pockets of the sex buying members of the public. And I wanted to stop. And one of the main reasons this law stops in relation to buyers is that they already know, as Pierre said, what they do is not acceptable, etc. So this law, it brings what they do in the dark into who they are in the day. And I spent 6 years with these men. I know them very well. And that's a risk most will not take. So I hope Scotland follows Ireland and Sweden and France, and we fought for freedom. We should have no problem, fighting for the freedom of others. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mia. I really appreciate hearing from you. Our next speaker is Tsitsi Matekaire. Tsitsi is the global lead for ending sex trafficking at Equality Now. She joined Equality Now in 2016 and provides strategic leadership on the organisation's global programme to end sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. She has over 16 years' experience of advocating for women's rights in Africa and in the UK. Tsitsi, over to you. Lovely to have you with us this evening.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy as well to be in this meeting tonight, and would like to thank the cross-party group on commercial sexual exploitation and UK Feminist for hosting and arranging, what I feel is a very important discussion at this point, and particularly as Scotland thinks of the way forward in terms of addressing demand. At Equality Now, we really believe in the power of the law as a means to bring about change for women and girls. So in the context of sex trafficking and prostitution, which we also appreciate are forms of sexual exploitation, we really believe that, governments need to be putting in place and implementing laws that are in line with international law. So really looking at, things like CEDAW, the Women's Convention, the Palermo Protocol, the 1949 Convention on for the suppression of the traffic in persons and of the exploitation of the prostitution of others. So that entire sort of international framework giving countries a basis to start from, as well as taking into account gender equality and human rights principles. I just wanted to start off by making the point, which I think others have said before as well, that sex trafficking and prostitution are really part of the continuum of violence against women, and that they are rooted in gender and systemic inequality and male entitlement. Broadly speaking, when we are thinking about the commercial sex trade or prostitution, I think most people default to thinking about the woman or the person who's selling sex. And it's not immediately that people think about the person who's buying, the pimps and the traffickers and the brothel keepers who are running the sex trade industry and making huge profits in the process. And I think even less considered are the systems and conditions that lead to people selling or being sold for sex and the conditions in which they do so. So this sort of person-centric view, which is focused on an individual, I think what it does is that it then reduces these systemic inequalities and conditions to be seen as obstacles that you can overcome at an individual level, rather than really looking at them as societal issues that require whole society interventions. So given this, I think it's extremely important that our analysis of the commercial sex trade takes a systemic approach. In our societies, as we know that gender and sex-based inequality and discrimination mean that women and girls are more likely to have limited access to resources, limited access to education, are more likely to be in poverty, more likely to experience child sexual abuse, and bear the brunt of other forms of marginalization like systemic racism, for instance. And I think we've also seen presently in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, how the pandemic has exposed and worsened the situation, increased levels of poverty, and so on across our societies, and placing even more vulnerable people at the risk of being trafficked or coerced into prostitution. So with all this, we begin to see that sexual exploitation is really part of the continuum of gender-based violence. We see this point as well clearly articulated in the Equally Safe strategy, where gender-based violence is defined as a function of gender inequality, and that this violence also includes violence perpetrated by men in relation to acts of commercial sexual exploitation, of which prostitution is one aspect. And also at the international level, what we've seen in just the last month in November, the CEDAW committee in its new general recommendation on trafficking in women and girls in the context of global migration, have also specifically reinforced the understanding that trafficking and exploitation of prostitution of women and girls is unequivocally a phenomenon that is rooted in structural gender-based discrimination, and that it constitutes gender-based violence, and that it's also exacerbated in the context of social and economic injustices, displacement, discrimination in migration and asylum regimes, for instance. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, those exploited in the sex trade experience physical violence and emotional trauma. So prostitution itself is inherently violent. There's no way, I think someone has said before, that we can look at it as anything that can be safe, because it is violence in itself. So taking all of that into account, it then sort of follows then that the legal and policy solutions we should be aiming for are exactly as other speakers have said before, which is the Nordic model, and really looking at removing any criminal sanctions on those exploited They should not be criminalized, as this amounts to, in fact, criminalizing people who are victims of the system and whose rights are being violated. The very existence of trafficking and prostitution makes women's right to equality unattainable. So, you know, really looking at taking away the criminality on the part of those that are exploited, and ensuring that they are supported as well as supported to exit. And that, you know, as we think about the laws we come up with and policy solutions, that within that we are also addressing the gender and systemic inequalities that breed vulnerability to exploitation. The second point really is that we cannot ignore the fact that sex trafficking and prostitution are driven by demand. So if we follow the money, it's coming from the pockets of those who are buying sex. From there, it then creates this chain of exploiters that are benefiting and profiting from the sex trade, your pimps, your brothel keepers, and traffickers. So without the demand of those that are buying, the sex trade would not exist and thrive. So in order to end the sexual exploitation, it really becomes imperative to address the demand. And addressing demand in law means criminalizing those who buy sex, and it amounts to shifting responsibility and accountability to those who are using their power, their money, their position of privilege to buy vulnerable people. And it's also about sending a strong message in society that it is unacceptable to buy sex. And we also need to then, you know, look at it in terms of wholesome legislation that then targets the range of actors involved in the exploitation chain, from procuring, pimping, and also strengthening existing trafficking legislation. Putting in place legislative measures to address demand is something that's already provided for in international law that the UK has ratified. So the UN Palermo Protocol on Trafficking mandates governments to take steps to discourage the demand that fosters all forms of exploitation of persons, especially women and girls, that leads to trafficking. And the CEDAW committee has also called on governments to address demand, particularly that they must investigate, prosecute, and convict all perpetrators involved in the trafficking of persons, including those on the demand side. And I think as we have had examples from France and Sweden and Ireland in terms of how, you know, that legislative model is working. In conclusion, I would say that in the long term, because what we are really aiming for is societal change, for society to look at prostitution as unacceptable. So to be effective, the legislative approach must be accompanied by widespread public information, you know, and education, training for police and others in the judicial system. And I think that has been the experience from other countries as well, that it really needs to be accompanied by in-depth training for the police, the judiciary, the prosecution, and frontline workers in education, social services. So really looking at the whole ambit of society, you know, the NHS and local government, and that we also need to ensure that the law is properly coordinated and implemented consistently at the national level. To ensure that, you know, what we then have is the law, but accompanied by some of these other measures to be able to have that sort of societal change that we are aiming for. Yeah, so I'd end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tsitsi. And I think the points you make about a systematic assessment of the problem being needed, rather than focusing just on the victims and the women involved, is a point very well made. Our final speaker this evening is Sigríður Björk Guðjónsdóttir. Prior to her appointment as National Commissioner, Sigríður was the Police Commissioner of Metropolitan Police in Reykjavik. Thank you very much for being with us this evening. We're happy to hear from you.
Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking the organizers, and especially to thank the survivors for their bravery. Thank you. I first want to make a little background. in the global context, Iceland has been successful when it comes to progress towards gender equality, and we are proud of our achievements. At the same time, we are aware of the numerous remaining challenges that we need to fulfill to fully close the gender gap. It has been a priority for the government to address intimate partner and gender-based violence against women. The Me Too movement and the alarming escalation in gender-based violence against women we've seen as results of COVID-19 pandemic is a case in point. We have approximately 15% increase, but that will be more because of the third wave. And for example, I am participating in a working group with a former Minister of Social Affairs, and we have the authority to take action and support initiatives to protect vulnerable groups from violence as possible. And the focus has been on the rights of survivors and to take legislative steps to increase these rights. And also in the police, we have been going from being an organization of power to an organization of service. And we are also listening to our clients. We are listening to the people we are to serve. And the approach is like outside in. It's not what I want to do for our community. It's what the community wants us to do. So this is hand in hand. You need to have the laws, but you also need to have the practice. And I'm here as the practical person. So yes, the focus has been on the rights of survivors and to take legislative steps to increase these rights. We aim to improve survivors' trust and access to the judicial system. For example, by improving the quality and speed of investigations, and also changing our investigations to be more effective and easier on the victim and in the right place in the circle of violence, so we can actually achieve something. And also, police is partnering in the Family Justice Center, and therefore we are lowering the thresholds for victims to seek assistance, and it's a common network with municipalities, state actors, and NGOs. So Iceland has put into action the first comprehensive policy on preventing sexual and gender-based violence and harassment, with an action plan for the next 4 years, and has a leadership role in the Action Coalition on Gender-Based Violence, with the goal of eliminating violence against women and girls, and to work towards achieving the important Sustainable Development Goals, number 5 on the gender equality. And to the matter at hand, a very important gender equality milestone was reached in 2009 and 2010, when the purchasing of sex was made illegal, along with commercial displays of nudity in restaurants. An absolute ban on the commercial exploitation of nudity of employees was also set. This was the Swedish model. And this type of legislation is based on the view that it is unacceptable to regard the human body as a saleable good. It was a very big change in our system, where the buyer of the sex was the criminal, but the seller had immunity. And it was a political decision. And it was brought forth by a parliamentary bill, not the government bill, but individual parliamentarians. And there was quite some opposition, as we heard in France, not maybe so difficult, but there was opposition. And if I remember correctly, even the national prosecutor opposed it at the time. But it went through, and it's very like the Swedish Bill of Law, Swedish Act. So anyone having his or her employment or upkeep from the prostitution of others shall be subject to imprisonment, or etc. So it's the same law. So the punishments are fines or prison up to a year, and first offense is a fine. And before the changes, the police and the judicial system were not putting any emphasis on prostitution. There were very few cases. I think there's one judgment. And after the changes, many investigations have been launched, and they have produced many cases because the seller of sex is more likely to cooperate with the police. As the Swedish presenter said, the power has changed. It's not as, the seller can trust the police better. They can provide their testimony, etc., which they could never have done before because they were also then being criminalized. It could have disastrous consequences for them also personally when it comes to, you know, the children and all kinds of things that could be involved. So this is giving us a better chance to bring cases to court, both where sex is bought and also in human trafficking. And we also are allowed to use phone tapping as a tool in investigation, even if there's a small frame of punishment, because usually you have to have 8 years of prison to be able to use this tool. But the reason is that cases of prostitution are often connected to human trafficking, and phone tapping is very important when it comes to the evidence. And we have had women who sell sex that have been able to seek help both through our Family Justice Center and also NGOs. And it's just such a big difference if they're engaging as criminals or not, both when it comes to healthcare and with regards to the legal standing if they're parents. And there is communal pressure on the police to take these cases on. Regularly, we have noise about it in the community. You know, why aren't you doing better? Why aren't there more cases? Because the cases do not come to us like drugs. We have to go out and get them. So it's good to have this pressure and understand that this is the acceptance of the community. And I firmly believe that this change, when the purchasing of sex was made illegal, is very important to deter sex buyers and to prevent sex trafficking, and that it was a necessary and important step. And to the Scottish committee, I want to say that there are people that have been doing this work before you, and there will be people after you, but this is your time to make a big difference. So I firmly believe that this was a very positive change. There's one thing that differs from the Swedish model here in Iceland, and that is the anonymity, that the buyers are anonymous. The courts have ruled that the names of the sex buyers should not be published, both for the protection of sellers of sex, but also for community reasons. In sex crime in general, the names of perpetrators have been published if they're not connected to the victim by family or such. So almost all the cases where sex is bought, it ends with fines. And I think in a very small community like us, if we would publish the names, that would finally be the end of the business. But that's something that we need then to take another change in the laws because of the decisions of the courts. So, thank you.
Sigríður, thank you very much for that. It's began raining very heavily here in Ayrshire. I hope it's not too noisy as I'm speaking to you all. We're a bit late starting and we've overrun a little bit, but I wonder if panel members would have just a couple of minutes more to spare for maybe a couple of questions. Najat, you spoke about leading this, the law change in France and the opposition, and I suppose it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about how you addressed the opposition. You did touch on it in your opening remarks, but how did you go about overcoming the opposition to that law change as a female parliamentarian?
Actually, what was very important for us, was to have more and more journalists agree with us, which means that what was very useful and precious was to have 1 and then 2 and then 3 women journalists, because it was women, that started to, to have debate in their newspapers with their colleagues and telling them you should not write this kind of things. And in order to have this outcome, I spent a lot of time meeting one-to-one with journalists and trying to make them change their mind with a lot of practical situations. I was very helped by all the survivors that were around me and who, described me their life and told me their story and so on. And then I could tell these stories to these journalists and make them change a little bit their mind. And that is, I think, what really helped us at the end, because the MPs or the members of government and so on often do what they think the journalist or the public opinion is waiting from them. I'm sorry, it's not very kind what I'm saying, but it's true. So you have to act like that, I think.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Diane, I wonder if I could come back to you just briefly. In your reflections, you did touch on this, but I suppose one of the things that opponents to changing legislation talk about is that we should be trying to make sex work safe. How would you respond to that that comment? Do you think you ever can make it safe?
No, I don't think you can ever make it safe. At the same time, I think it's important to do everything we can to increase safety while someone is still involved in prostitution. So I don't disagree with attempts and work around harm minimization. So I believe harm minimization is important while someone is still involved in prostitution. Of course, if we want to reduce any kind of harm, whether it's around health or housing or violence, whatever it is, but overarching the existence of harm minimization while someone is still involved in prostitution, I fundamentally believe it's not something we can ever make safe. And often people will talk about, improved labor laws and labor rights. And if we just get it to this place, it's just impossible. It would be how you would ever implement any kind of health and safety legislation where prostitution was accepted as a job like any other. I have no idea. Not particularly, but even more ludicrous to think about the current pandemic. It's just, I actually saw a piece of film, can't remember where, I think it was probably Facebook, and I think it was in Germany, where they were trying to create a safe situation because of COVID. And what it was basically a woman on a table lying with her legs apart, and then someone had made some kind of makeshift barrier over her waist, and she was lying down, and then they were seeing, how the guy could possibly get into a position. It's just, I can't even believe I've actually said that, and that I know that that's true. I saw it with my own eyes. That's how absolutely ridiculous it is. So no, I think it's interesting. I'm thinking of what Mia said about being on the street. My experience in prostitution was very off street, but the project that I started and ran was predominantly women exploited through street-based prostitution. And they used to say, oh, I feel safer on the street, because once you get into a car, you're in a kind of a metal box with a complete stranger who, as Mia said, then really has all the power. So oh, there's just so much violence. No, I don't think that you can ever make it safe. I think all this nonsense about screening people is just nonsense. I mean, Mia and I wouldn't have been raped so many times or had so much violence visited upon our bodies and our minds if it could be made safe. And again, I was in in the time that I was exploited through prostitution, I was in what people would have said was the working for the safest agency in London, and then exploited overseas by ministers and government and members of other countries' royal family. So it wasn't safe there with all the nice wallpaper and the diplomatic cars. So, but at the same time, of course, while someone's still involved in prostitution, we want to do everything that we can to support them. So sorry, bit of a ramble.
Very helpful and appreciate it. Per Anders, if I can just ask you a final question. Do you ever encounter Sweden's Sex Purchase Act and the impact of it being misrepresented? And if so, what are the sort of common misrepresentations that you hear, and how would you address those?
I think actually that was one of the main reasons my government decided that they wanted an envoy on this issue, because we knew that there was many people out there talking about the Swedish law, saying it failed, and arguing, that just made it worse for those in prostitution and so on. So that's been one of my main tasks to give true evidence about the consequences of the law in Sweden. And I've heard things like, well, first of all, that it went underground, of course, which is not true. That it made it more dangerous, which is not true. I met with some women in prostitution just recently in Germany, about a month ago when I visited Germany, because they're discussing to change their law in Germany, and they were in prostitution, and they said, well, we know that in Sweden the social security is taking the kids from those who are in prostitution, and we also know that the police evict people from their apartments, those who are in prostitution. And I really investigated this and looked into this, and it's just not true that either. Sweden, as most countries, have a legislation which makes it possible to take a child from a very dangerous setting with the child's parents, but the threshold is very high, and we haven't had one case where someone lost a child just because they were in prostitution. We had a case, but that was because there was violence and narcotics and drugs in the family. And the same goes for being evicted from your apartment. There's not one case where someone has been evicted just because he or she was in prostitution. So, no. These are just people trying to say that this is not a good law, but for us it's been excellent. And today there's 100%, every party is behind it. And actually the Swedish government, together with the parliament, is now preparing a bill to take away fines from so it will always be mandatory prison if you buy sex. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I guess, as you said in your remarks, comparing Sweden and Germany gives a helpful view of what happens depending on what route you go down. Folks, thank you very much for joining us, to all the panel members and everybody who watched, and thank you for staying longer than we said we would keep you. I mentioned at the beginning that Scotland's policy intention for women and girls in our legislation doesn't quite match yet. The Scottish Government are consulting on changing that, and they're consulting on how to tackle men's demand for prostitution. So if after listening this evening you feel that you wish to contribute to that, please do respond to the consultation. Anybody can respond, any citizen. You don't need to be an expert. You don't have to answer every consultation question. It's pretty simple and straightforward, and it could make a huge difference. You can find guidance and background information about the consultation on the website of our cross-party group on commercial sexual exploitation, which is cpg-cse.com. So with that, just a final thanks to all of our speakers. It was wonderful to hear your personal and professional reflections this evening, and thank you so much for joining us. Good night.
Thank you, Ruth. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye. Bye, Mia.